Bonjour and welcome back to Blumera Podcast. I'm your host, Brianne. Today we are talking about what it really means to build resilience. Not the kind that asks you to keep surviving, but the kind that helps you feel safe, grounded, and alive in your body again. I'm joined by Nkem Ndefo, founder of Lumos Transforms and the creator of the Resilience Toolkit. Nkem is a licensed nurse midwife, somatic practitioner, and educator whose work bridges trauma-informed care, body awareness, and social justice. In this episode, we talk about how to use the nervous system as a guide to healing, how it shapes your emotions, your limits, and your ability to recover from stress. We talk about what resilience actually looks like in practice and how to build it without bypassing your pain. If you've ever felt like you're stuck in survival mode, this conversation will help you understand your body's signals so you can find your way back to safety, compassion, and strength. So without further ado, let's dive right into the interview with Nkem. What does self-regulation mean to you?
Self-regulation has a few different components. I think hidden in it or understood or assumed is self-awareness. You've got to know where you are, right? As the starting point. And what also is hidden in that self-regulation is discernment, discerning if your response is useful in the moment or not. Because there's often conversation in the wellness world, in the trauma healing world about don't be dysregulated, be perfectly regulated, which kind of ignores or patently ignores the reality that sometimes the lives we're living, we need to be upregulated. We need to be activated into stress or even a trauma response. So self-regulation is the capacity to be aware of what your system is doing, what state you're in, to be able to discern is it useful now or not. And then the third piece is the skill to be able to shift down, typically down, your activation to match more appropriately what's needed in the moment.
Why do you think not many people have been taught self-regulation?
It's a really good question. And I wonder, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of factors, but one of the biggest is, dominant white North American, Western European culture is Cartesian at this point. And by Cartesian, meaning, Descartes' mind-body split. And this idea that the mind controls the body is an inconvenience at best, that everything needs to be rational, to be valuable. Emotions are, we say, oh, you're just being emotional, right? Like they don't have value. And so when we over focus on the mental, the cognitive, we think we can solve all problems through cognitive and will. And there's this real denigration or dismissal of what the body wisdom is there, or that the body is interacting with, right? Like the same blood flows from into your brain and into your body, right? There is a connection. And so I think that legacy has made us afraid of our bodies, not given us tools to understand our bodies and our body responses. I generally see people have a poverty of language to describe their interiority, their interior, internal experience. And so when you have generation after generation after generation and a culture that is set up in this way, it's definitely not going to prioritize self-regulation. In fact, it's afraid of it and pushes it away, partly because it's unknown and feels like when something is unknown, we can't handle it or manage it, or it's scary in some kind of way. And it's, sometimes I use the analogy like, imagine you did not speak Mandarin and you were asked today, or basically told, tomorrow you're going to give a presentation at university level in Mandarin. And you'd be like, like freaking out because I don't have the skills. I don't know. Right. And so you'd be like, this is terrible. And I feel like some people around self-regulation are the same, like it's a black box. I can't know. And so the culture is, and we just pushes it aside, or it's seen as a nice to have. That's the other thing I see is like, I do a lot of organizational work, working with, groups and organizations. And it's always like, well, if we have some extra money, if it's nice to have have a wellness initiative so people can kind of do some self-regulation instead of understanding that the entire relational field of your organization, the health of that depends on people's capacity for self-regulation, that people's engagement, their work performance, their creativity, right? Like all of those things are so integral to their capacity to self-regulate. But partly it's again seen as other, or, I mean, I think in some places it's changing, but we got a long way to go.
Agree. How can somebody begin to recognize when their nervous system is activated or dysregulated?
I mean, I like to invite curiosity. I think curiosity is a really nice way in. It's very hard to be in judgment and curiosity at the same time because a lot of times we're judging I shouldn't be upset. I shouldn't be X, Y, or Z. If you can invite curiosity of like what's going on here, and I do think some basic nervous system education, which I definitely do that's a big part of the work that I do in the Resilience Toolkit is using different models to help people understand what the signs in their body, in their emotions, in their behavior, in their thinking might mean. And so you're basically handing someone a map. And that with that map, then they can begin to start to locate themselves if they're curious, right? So you invite curiosity and then say, here's a map, and like, let's work together and find where you are on this map now. And what about now? And what about now? And I will say that for a lot of people, when they start and do this, people aren't great at estimating what level they are. If I can tell a story, it was many years ago, this was one of the very early sort of biofeedback programs called Heart Math. I think it might still exist, but this was like, version one. And it was like an ear probe or a finger probe, and you put it on and you could basically see what someone's heart rate variability was about, basically kind of how their stress is as a proxy for stress. And it was so interesting because I would put it on. I was doing a health fair at a school, and it was primarily for faculty and staff. And they would come on and they'd put on their little finger probe, and I'd say, give your stress a number, 0 to 10. And people would say, oh, it's a 2. And you're looking at the monitor and saying, if that's a 2 for you, like, what is a 7? Right? So, and then they're shocked because what they've accustomed themselves to is such a high degree, right? That it's hard to appraise. And so I think there's a learning process that happens with this over time. And this is one of the ways I do find it helpful to learn this is to teach short practices that ideally will help down-regulate or pull down the stress response. And so that's an easier way for people to tell is because I think I'm here, but then I do a practice and it changed. So what information, like it's for many people, it's hard to analyze when they have one data point. Like I'm right now, right here. But when they have a second one after doing a practice, they have something to compare it to. And they go, oh, I realize my shoulders relaxed and I didn't even realize they were tense before, right? So it helps bring in awareness. Additionally, physiologically, the more stressed we are, the less connected we are to our bodies and less clarity of mind, less able to distinguish which emotion. We can just go like, I'm overwhelmed, but we can't really distinguish what they are. So even when people their stress comes down a little bit, they get a little bit better at saying, what is here?
What are some of the common stress responses that you see or that we can look out for in our body? I know you mentioned the shoulders tensing. That's a big one for me. I'm curious what other things are the most common.
I like to kind of give when I'm teaching like, real basic foundational stuff, because you can get very complex and there's lots of nuance that I don't think is talked about enough. But to start with, I like to use sort of these general qualities that help people understand. So if I use the word pressured, right? And what might that mean? That might mean my body feels physical pressure, usually inwards and upwards. So shoulders in and up, right? Stomach tense, jaw tense, so there's a tension and a pressure, but that pressure can also be mental. So I feel pressed about the work that I have to do or what's on my plate, but the pressure can also be in perspective. I go from a wide open, very like accepting perception or of the world. And as it gets pressured, it gets narrower, where I'm only able to perceive until it gets to like tunnel vision. That's another way pressured can show up. And then time pressure. Hurry, there's not enough time. So that one word can give you so many different signs that you are activated and what I would say is adrenalized. And, you know, another common word that I use is disconnected. So disconnected would be a higher level than an adrenalized state. And it would be disconnected in the way of I can't feel my body very well. I feel numb. I'm disconnected from my feelings, apathetic. I don't disconnected from other people. I don't, lack of empathy, right? I'm disconnected from my thoughts. I'm kind of blank or foggy. I'm disconnected from my power. I feel powerless. Like there's nothing I can do. I'm disconnected from the future and hope. I feel hopeless, stuck. And when you put those all together, that's like a very shut down or freeze-like state. But if you use the word disconnected, it will give you all of the or not all of them, but many of the possibilities for that particular state to help you. And these are how we build maps, right? We build these maps with folks when we practice the Resilience Toolkit is how do I use this map? And sometimes the map might not work for you because, as I said earlier, there are more nuanced stress states that don't get talked about as much, but do exist. And so if you don't find yourself in one map, we need to bring out another map to help you understand yourself.
What are some of those nuanced states that people might not expect to find themselves in?
Um, Hypervigilance, right? So hypervigilance, or technically it's called attentive immobility, where you're stuck in this state of vigilance and jumpiness, right? And one of the cues for that one is people will have a lot of tension in their neck and upper back, right? Because that is how humans respond to threat is we say, what was that? And we kind of turn our heads and we look around and our neck muscles tighten. So it's going to be a very specific state when you see that. And it's important to know because there's other practices that will work better for this state. For example, if you're in that state, some of the practices to settle might be, looking around your environment. But if you are in that state and you look around your environment, it typically makes you worse. So it's important, right, to know. Other more nuanced states have to do with appeasement. And this is really common. It happens when there's a power differential. Someone has more power than another. And here it's like you feel all of the adrenaline. I want to fight. I want to run away. I want to, say something, do something, but it's not safe. So you almost collapse and freeze it in yourself. So you're going to feel like adrenalized and shut down at the same time. And that is often associated with a lot of shame. Why didn't I react? Why didn't I say anything? What's wrong with me? Like a lot of second guessing. So again, it has its own map. And then there's one that's almost never talked about called tend and befriend. And tend and befriend. So this is, fun fact. Almost all stress research, and I'm talking almost all, is done on white men from North America and Western Europe who have low amounts of estrogen. Guess what? Estrogen influences the stress response. Oxytocin, too, also, which tends to be higher in females, influences the stress response. And so there's research around tend and befriend where you have more oxytocin and estrogen in the mix. And instead of going straight to what we would call fight flight or that kind of adrenalized state, it actually goes into a caregiving state. But it's a stress state. It's not relaxed caregiving. And what in that state is we are typically, like an example of this would be, let's say you had small children and it was dangerous outside. You are going to go into hyper caregiving mode to keep the kids quiet so that you don't attract danger from the outside. That's a stress response, but it's not fight flight. It's actually like caring. Or let's say you had a really toxic boss and it was unsafe for you, like directly to the boss, you're appeasing because it's unsafe. You're going to lose your job if you say something. But what you do is you make a really good friends with your coworkers so you are stronger together. That's called tend and befriend, right? So it's not a typical what we know when testosterone and some other hormones hit, vasopressin hit with the stress response that you see more commonly in males, you're going to see more fight flight. And again, it's a much more nuanced conversation. And I think, especially in the healing world, we're hearing a lot about fight, flight, freeze, fawn. We hear about polyvagal theory. And just to know, these are just some of many, and there's no one model that's going to work for everybody.
I appreciate you bringing all of that nuance in and the education about how most of those studies are done on white male and in the United States too. That really makes a difference when you're working through some of your healing to understand why some of it's a little different for you if you're not a white male.
And, I mean, was reading a study, and I'm going to say this study was 2017, and it was around stress responses, and they expressly excluded any menstruating person and their rationale in the study was because the hormones fluctuate, and that's going to change the results. So if the menstruating person was on birth control pills and you had a steady state of hormones, they were allowed in the study. So what is it basically saying? If you have fluctuating hormones through the month, you're abnormal and we can't really study you but that's the reality of our existence and is going to impact. And this isn't just research on stress, like the research on traumatic brain injury depends where in the menstrual cycle you get the traumatic brain injury, what the effects are going to be, because it depends how high estrogen is.
That's fascinating and infuriating, both at the same time.
It is.
And I know you've mentioned some of the benefits already, but I'd like it all in one package, kind of. What are some of the benefits of regulating?
Well, I mean, first I want to say, if you need a stress or trauma response because it's protective, there is no benefit in regulating. I want to be really clear. And I don't want people, because sometimes people feel like, why am I so upset? I should be calmer. And they're self-gaslighting because in reality, the situation is bad and they should be upset. So I just want to say that first. However, if you're in an over response to whatever the situation is, it doesn't, being overly vigilant, being overly rigid, being overly focused, like any over is not going to help the situation. So when you can regulate down to what you need in the situation, you're going to be able to access more connection with yourself, more empathy, more ability to listen, more openness to learn and to the unknown, more patience. You're going to access a greater spaciousness around time, right? So all of those things is like, wow, who wouldn't want that? And especially, I mean, even if you're in a stressful situation, if you can bring in even a little bit of that, it's going to help you navigate that much better than if you're in an over response. I mean, I think one more example I would give is sleep. Like, no matter how stressful your job is and how stressful your life is, like everyone needs to sleep. And unless there's an active danger in your home, in your bed, nobody needs to be carrying the level of tension that we have in the day into the night. And so, one of the benefits of regulating before bedtime, guess what? You're not pumping adrenaline through your sleep. Your quality of sleep is better. You wake more refreshed. In addition, your blood sugar management is better. There's so many, your blood pressure, all kinds of things, your immune system, all for that. And then you wake up and you're more better equipped to deal with whatever the issue is. So again, over responses or responses that don't match the certain timing, it's always behooves us to bring it down.
I really appreciate you bringing up when it's safe, or I guess when it's not safe and you need to have that trauma response. I'm a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault, and I have done that self-gaslighting in situations where I'm like, I just need to calm down. I need to, regulate myself to match everybody else in the situation. I had a situation couple years ago where I was at a party and there was somebody, a white male, making racist, sexist jokes about violence against women. And I was the only one speaking up. And it felt like there was something wrong with me. Everybody else was calm. Everybody else was telling me to calm down. And I'm obviously looking back on it, can tell that my response was appropriate and necessary. And I'm curious in those moments when you're the only one reacting to injustices, how you can stand firm in yourself and be able to see your truth, even if you're self gaslighting or kind of being gaslit by people around you.
First, I want to say I'm really sorry you had that experience. And I also want to say, I don't know you that well, and I still want to say I'm proud of you for speaking up, because it's not the easy thing to do. I'd like to back up and give a little context about this behavior, where the self-gaslighting that we do. And because I want to bring a little compassion into it. Those of us who do it typically grew up in families where, or families or caregiving situations where our needs were not being met. And in order to get through, we had to convince ourselves, right, that it was okay. Otherwise, we're not going to get through. So there's this fiction, and it's a childlike fiction typically, because if the only people we depend on, we actually are able to recognize that they are not caring for us in the way we need to be cared for. We are really sunk. And so that's where we get the first training into blaming ourselves for conditions that we didn't create. And there are some people who need to take more accountability, but there are other people who are taking too much accountability. And so what you're describing is most likely like the constellation of I'm a person who takes over responsibility for situations I didn't create. I should be the calm one. I should be the this. And we end up, if we have that childhood priming, we end up in relationships where, whether they're work, friendships, romantic relationships, where we have this similar dynamic. And it's actually for us to it's not a one and done, like in the moment, I'm suddenly going to break this, right? These are deep survival patterns that and they were amazing because they got us through. So shedding a survival pattern, I think we have to first have compassion for where it came from, which means we stop fighting the survival pattern and we learn to work with it and recognize, you know what, right now it actually is really unsafe and let me be quiet, let me appease, let me do the thing. And I can say something when it is safe. But to be able to say like, hey, it actually is a bit safer here. I'm an adult. I can walk or roll away. I have a lot more choices and a lot more resources than I had when I was little. And I can push against and say no. And often we have to start really small and celebrate those small wins before we can get to some of the bigger ones, like what you're talking about.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate that. And that's super healing for me. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like,
And I want to say even one other thing. If you didn't do it in the moment, like you didn't, like let's say the situation you just described, and you just froze, you appeased, you went into your old patterns, and afterwards you're like, why didn't I say anything, right? Here's a tip, and it's really healing, is to imagine yourself back in the situation afterwards when you're alone, and what are the things you would say? How would you say them? And really spend the time to feel in your body what it would feel like if you had said them. But what's key about doing this is that you really concentrate to how it feels in your body. Like I feel strong and I feel my shoulders back and because what you're doing is you're building a memory, right? Our brains are really cool, for better or worse, when we really imagine something with great detail and sensory detail, it becomes a memory, right? Then, should that situation happen again, you now have a memory of having done it and you can draw on it. So, all is not lost if you didn't do it in the moment. You can always do a retrospective, redo, or, a do-over.
I think that's really powerful, especially feeling what you would have wanted to feel in the moment saying those things. You read me like a book, by the way. And I really appreciate it. It's been a healing process. I was met with sexual assault after that. So there was a lot of looking back and saying, maybe I shouldn't have said those things. Maybe I shouldn't have spoken up. But with a lot of perspective and time and healing, I would have done it all over again. And you even just talking about the feelings in the moment, I can call on that more than the pain that came after. But I really appreciate your compassion and understanding in all of that.
Of course, I, have a similar journey and worked with people, one is realizing the advantages of working with lots of people is I realize how common these patterns are, which is heartbreaking and also unifying.
I agree. It happens all too often. Okay, so we're going to talk about your resilience toolkit. But first, I'm curious what the word resilience means to you.
Resilience for some people is a dirty word because it's used as a weapon against people who are already resilient to gaslight them and say you should be more resilient, basically said by people who are abusing or extracting from you. So I don't mean it that way. To me, resilience is about flexible strength, like bamboo. It bends in the wind, it doesn't break, but it has enough integrity and backbone that it can bounce back. But more than that, sometimes the place we start isn't so great. So if I bounce back, was that after all that I've been through? Like this is what I get, my exact same starting point. So I like to think of maybe bouncing forward, right? So resilience is taking that, having that flexible strength to withstand adversity and then to come forward and heal, and also to have capacity to change some of the systems or relationships that created the adversity in the first place. So, really, a very expansive definition of resilience.
I love that. Much more whole and I can't think of the right word, but it's much more complex than the dictionary definition, and I appreciate that. What are the core components of your resilience toolkit?
To build that kind of resilience, we first focus on helping folks develop an embodied understanding of stress, trauma responses, and relaxation responses. I don't think those are given enough attention, right? So that people can really understand for themselves where they are at any given moment in real time. And then we really work with folks to help them discern are their responses adaptive and useful moment to moment? And if they're not, how to choose and use real-time practices that are like 30 seconds to 2 minutes, very short, to lower responses that don't match the situation. And one of the really key things is that not all practices work for everybody. And so we really work with folks so that they understand for themselves which practices work and when and how do they know? Like, how do I judge? Does the breathing help me? Does this help me? Like, which ones? Because there's a ton of practices out there. And again, does anyone ask you, like, how do I know? Does this work for me? So that's really core. And then another big piece when I developed the toolkit is I realized, I mean, I've been working in the healing healthcare wellness world for decades at this point, and there's again so many good tools, but it doesn't do any good if it's not in your hand. It's not in your daily practice. Somebody is selling you something, a fantasy, if they think you can do one class or one breath circle or one whatever it is, and suddenly everything is great. We want to believe that in our hearts, but it's not true. It takes time to repattern these things. And so a key component of the toolkit is how do we work with ambivalence about practice? How do we work through obstacles to practice? How do we integrate this into our lives as a daily practice as well as when we specially need it? So that's a big focus. And ultimately, we're hoping that we're developing, we don't hope, we see it actually. We do a lot of research and have outside researchers have looked at our work too with the toolkit, is that people develop the capacity to change or leave harmful circumstances. So if you're healing something in the past, that's one thing. But if it's something ongoing, that this is not just academic, you're just having resilience, that people are able to change and leave harmful circumstances. And so those are the key components of the toolkit.
That's really beautiful that you can have that impact on people leaving harmful situations. I think that I mean, so many people try so hard to fix themselves when it's the situation that is the problem and not themselves or their reactions to it. I appreciate
Yeah.
you bringing.
It's very rarely one-sided. We may have some responsibility in a situation. I just see a fair, it just seems to be this binary of people who take no responsibility and then the people who take all the responsibility. And I'm like, hey y'all, like can we like have some evening out here? So both are true.
And it reminds me of the locus of control, realizing where you sit in that. So I know you mentioned some of those short practices that may or may not work for people. Breathing is one of the more common ones, but I also know that can be a trigger for a lot of trauma survivors. What are some just like 3 or 4 practices that people might be able to use instead of breathing to see if it works better?
Well, I will say for breathing, not just is it a trigger for trauma survivors, like it's breathing has never worked for me. And I was recently diagnosed as being hypermobile, and people who are hypermobile often have problems with breathing due to some changes in connective tissue that are from hypermobility. And I was like, oh, no wonder it's never worked for me. So that's like was a really interesting learning. But there's a lot of different kinds of breathing. One of the tips is having a slightly longer exhale than inhale, because when you inhale, your heart beats a little faster, and when you exhale, your heart beats a little slower. So that idea of sort of box breathing, where it's the same inhale and exhale, you're not getting the same effect. If you just have a slightly longer exhale, you're kind of slowing things down. So that's one thing to give a try before you're like, out with the breathing. There's lots of different practices. We don't have a ton in the toolkit because we don't believe we need a ton. There's a whole class of movements that we have in the toolkit that are what we call crossing the midline. So they're involve bilateral stimulation. And it's really anything where you cross the midline. So even if you're walking quickly or running, do you notice how one arm goes in front of you and the other arm goes in front of you? That's one of the reasons it works. You're getting some it settles you because you're crossing the midline, right? So even like twisting your upper body, putting one hand on one side, one hand on the other, there's a number of different, and people will naturally do this. People kind of cross their feet and like will rub their feet. So it's so interesting to see those helpful. Different mindfulness attention on our external senses or what feels good in the body in the moment or best. And then key in the toolkit is we teach people how to activate a deep mammalian reflex that resets the stress and trauma cycle. And so that is a practice I really love because it's the only one that's actually a mammal reflex. And so we teach folks how to turn that on through some gentle movement and how to turn it off and how to work with it. And so that's really powerful. Like 15 seconds of that, and you're like, whoa, whew, that feels great. So that's a big part of the toolkit too.
That's incredible. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing in the world.
Thank
I know you
you.
mentioned power dynamics earlier. I'm curious what some of the power dynamics surrounding resilience are.
Well, I mean, who gets to define who is resilient? So there's often like a story that we hear about children not being resilient in schools. But I actually find there's a lack of curiosity about what children's lives are actually like. Do they have enough to eat? Are they safe at home? Are they being bullied in school? Right? Um, that these are kids that might be overcoming huge odds just to be having their butt in the seat and they're being told they're not resilient. So I think the definition who gets to decide and tell each other how resilient you are is a big part of the power dynamics around this. That I think self-determination and self-definition is really important.
And how can we manage our stress levels when you are living in a stress inducing political climate or when facing oppression or fighting for social justice, when the situation outside of you cannot be changed, but you need to kind of cope with that?
I think that's the reality for most people, honestly. And the truth of the matter is, most people try to avoid and distract, disconnect, and then you unfortunately are reconnected and you're like, oh, it's never any better. And so you just have this cycle of where people are using disconnection as a management strategy, and it actually just worsens it. And so, what I encourage instead is, again, to invite curiosity. Very rarely is whatever you're living through, no matter how intense, at the exact same pace and intensity 24/7. There's going to be peaks and valleys. There's going to be moments, even if they're 2 minutes, where it's like, wait, nothing's happening right now. And so the key this is about having that discernment is right. Like I'm really keyed up because of X, Y, and Z. But wait a second, is that like happening right now in my house in the last 5 minutes? No. Can I let 10% of this go? So I think that is really important, that ability to appraise the nuance of the situation and find moments, even if they're small, of respite. When I developed the Resilience Toolkit, I did it with people who could not escape their situations. If you're an emergency, responder, first responder, if you're a gang intervention worker, if you're unhoused and living on the street, where are you going on vacation and retreat? This is your life, right? And so I really designed the Resilience Toolkit for people in the midst of it. And what I found, if I can give an example, was early in the pandemic, I did some work supporting hospital chaplains. And this is in New York City in April and May of 2020, where, content warning, they were having funerals for 30 healthcare workers at a time in mass burials, right? So very intense. These are people who are showing up for work, not knowing if they're going to make it. They're going to get sick. They'll be the next one. One of them told me at the end of every shift, she would go and put her hand on the morgue trucks outside just to say a prayer over all of the bodies, right? So these are people, I can't really think of something more intense, honestly, of what they were doing because they are ministering to the not just the patients, but they're ministering to the nurses and the doctors and everybody, right? And they still got off shift and had to sleep. And so we would practice, like they would come and do sessions when they got off shift, because we, at that point in the pandemic, were doing sessions 3 times a day of the toolkit. And they would do it at the end. And so it would help them go to sleep and just get just enough rest that they could do the calling that they had in the world the next day. So, these are really intense political times. These are really intense economic times. And it doesn't erase all joy. It doesn't erase all love, because then it really has won. Like, so finding those little moments and, again, not at the exclusion of not paying attention to what's going on. It's a both and.
I really appreciate that. I have a Feminine Rage book club that started due to all of the politics, and that question comes up a lot. People wanting to stay connected, but also needing to disconnect. And I just really appreciate your take on that.
Mm.
Resilience doesn't mean never falling apart. It means knowing how to come back to yourself when you do. As Nkem reminded us, our nervous systems are designed for recovery, connection, and growth. When we learn to listen, we stop fighting our body and start healing with it. To learn more about Nkem Ndefo and the Resilience Toolkit, visit lumostransforms.com. And if this episode spoke to you, please share it with somebody who might be able to use the reminder that resilience doesn't just come from strength, it also comes from safety. The next episode is the second part of this interview. We'll talk about how we can take these same trauma-informed principles and transform the way that we lead, the way we parent, organize, and create change in our communities. Healing ourselves is only the beginning. Healing together is where the real magic happens. I'll see you in the next episode.